December 1941. The Pacific Ocean stretches without edges. Dark, heavy, unforgiving. Steel decks glisten under thin salt spray as dawn breaks somewhere east of Japan's newly claimed perimeter. Engines hum low beneath armored hulls. Sailors stand quietly at their stations, breath fogging in the cool air. There is no celebration here, only calculation. Across thousands of miles of open water, American naval power, damaged, burning, and written off by many, has not disappeared. It has gone silent. Japanese planners had measured distances. They had counted ships. They had calculated tonnage and fuel. They believed the ocean itself would slow any response, that the United States, wounded at Pearl Harbor, would hesitate before crossing the Salt again in force. But steel travels farther than expected when time is no longer a constraint. In shipyards along both American coasts, hulls take shape day and night. Rivets hammer without pause. Steel meets steel while the sea waits patiently beyond the docks. What Japan expects is delay. What forms instead is momentum. Out here, between sky and water, the war is about to reveal a truth neither side can yet fully see. The moment is approaching when assumptions will collide with reality, and the Pacific will become the proving ground. Long before the first American hull turned back toward the Western Pacific, Japanese naval planners believed they understood how the war would unfold. Their worldview was shaped by geography, memory, and doctrine. Japan was an island nation. The sea was both shield and lifeline. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had studied one central question: how to defeat a stronger industrial opponent before that opponent's strength could fully arrive. The answer, refined since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, was the doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. In this model, war in the Pacific would not be a prolonged contest of production. It would be a carefully staged sequence. Japan would strike first. Forward bases would be seized. The enemy fleet would advance across vast ocean distances, weakened by attrition, submarines, and air attacks. Then, somewhere in the Western Pacific, Japan's main battle fleet would deliver a crushing blow. The enemy, shocked by losses and distance, would negotiate. This thinking shaped every pre-war Japanese naval decision. Battleships remained symbols of ultimate power, even as aircraft carriers grew in importance. Long-range torpedoes were prioritized. Crews trained relentlessly for night combat. The ocean itself was treated as an ally, an empty expanse that would stretch American supply lines thin and drain morale before the decisive engagement ever began. When Japan looked east in 1941, it did not see an agile naval opponent. It saw a slow-moving industrial giant, politically divided and psychologically unprepared for sacrifice. American isolationism was read not as caution, but as weakness. Even after years of rising tension, many Japanese officers believed the United States lacked the will for a long, distant war. Pearl Harbor was meant to lock this assumption in place. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor in Hawaii, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing more than 2,400 Americans. From Tokyo's perspective, the attack achieved its immediate objective. It removed the American battle line and bought time, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year, to secure an empire stretching from Southeast Asia to the Central Pacific. But time, in Japanese calculations, was always a finite resource. Their planners knew America's industrial capacity in abstract terms. They had seen the numbers: steel output, shipyards, oil. But numbers on paper felt distant, theoretical, detached from the lived reality of naval war. What mattered more was the belief that democratic societies lost patience quickly, that public outrage would fade into negotiation once casualties mounted and distances proved unforgiving. As Japanese forces surged south and east in early 1942, capturing Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, the assumptions seemed validated. American and Allied units fell back. Ships were lost. The Pacific appeared too vast for an immediate counterstroke. Yet beneath these victories lay a misreading of the enemy. The United States was not preparing for a single decisive battle. It was preparing to cross an ocean again and again, with steel, fuel, and men, until assumptions themselves began to corrode. And that miscalculation would define everything that followed. While Japanese planners measured the Pacific in miles and months, American war planning was beginning to measure it in factories, slipways, and schedules. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not paralyzed the United States. It had clarified it. Within days, isolationist arguments collapsed. Congress declared war almost unanimously. The question in Washington was no longer whether to fight, but how fast power could be projected across saltwater on a scale never attempted before. American naval doctrine entered the war bruised, but adaptable. Battleships lay damaged in Pearl Harbor's mud, but aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, had survived by chance away from harbor on December 7th. Their survival would quietly shift the center of gravity of the Pacific War. Unlike battleships, carriers were mobile, flexible, and capable of striking far beyond the horizon. Behind them stood something Japan could not replicate: industrial elasticity. American shipyards did not merely replace losses. They multiplied capability. Standardized designs allowed hulls to be assembled faster than enemy intelligence believed possible. Liberty ships and tankers slid into the water in weeks, not years. Damaged vessels were not written off. They were salvaged, patched, and returned to service with relentless efficiency. Steel flowed inland from mills to coasts without interruption. The Pacific itself became a logistical problem to be solved rather than a barrier to be feared. Admiral Ernest J. King, newly appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. fleet, pushed for aggressive action even while rebuilding was underway. He rejected the idea of waiting passively for a decisive battle on Japanese terms. Instead, American forces would probe, raid, and learn, testing Japanese defenses while refining carrier tactics in real time. This approach confused Japanese observers. Early American strikes, small carrier raids in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, the Doolittle raid over Tokyo in April 1942, did little material damage. But they carried psychological weight. They demonstrated reach. They demonstrated intent. And most importantly, they demonstrated that the Pacific was not empty, it was navigable. At sea, American crews adapted quickly. Radar was integrated into fleet operations. Damage control doctrine, rigorous, procedural, almost industrial in mindset, kept ships afloat that would have been lost under other navies' practices. Pilots learned to coordinate strikes across moving decks in rough seas. Commanders began to think of carriers not as support units, but as the fleet itself. Japan, meanwhile, faced structural constraints it could not escape. Its shipbuilding capacity was limited. Oil had to be imported across vulnerable sea lanes. Experienced pilots, trained through years of meticulous preparation, were irreplaceable once lost. Every engagement carried hidden risk. Yet Japanese confidence endured. Early victories reinforced the belief that American resolve would crack before Japan's perimeter did. The ocean, still vast and hostile, seemed to favor the defender. What neither side fully understood yet was how quickly these opposing trajectories, one fueled by replacement and adaptation, the other by expectation and exhaustion, were converging. Somewhere in the open Pacific, steel hulls were already moving toward one another, carried by saltwater and assumption alike. And soon, theory would be tested by fire. Steel and salt defined the machines of the Pacific War, but it was human endurance that kept them moving. For American sailors, The ocean was no longer a frontier. It was a workplace measured in watches and fatigue. Days blurred into nights under constant engine vibration. Sleep came in short intervals. Salt-crusted uniforms and skin alike. Many crews were young, some barely trained, learning carrier operations while already at war. There was no illusion of safety. Aircraft launches were dangerous even in calm seas. A single misstep on a pitching deck could mean death. Damage control drills were repeated obsessively, not for ceremony, but because survival depended on muscle memory when steel was torn open and fire-filled enclosed spaces. Japanese sailors lived under a different pressure. They carried the weight of expectation, the belief that they were the sharp edge of a carefully planned war. Training had been rigorous, almost brutal. Discipline was absolute. Yet beneath that confidence lay a quiet awareness. Losses could not be easily replaced. Every pilot, every engineer mattered. At sea, isolation magnified emotion. There were no civilians, no front lines, only horizon and hull. Fear was rarely spoken. Instead, routine became a shield. Men focused on tasks, trusting steel and doctrine to hold when tested. That trust would soon be strained. Japanese naval tactics entered the war with clarity of purpose. Night engagements were emphasized. Long-range torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance, were designed to cripple enemy fleets before gunfire ever began. Carrier aviation was seen as a preparatory arm, softening targets for the decisive clash of surface ships. American tactics evolved in motion. Early war experience forced rapid learning. Carrier task forces were reorganized around mutual air defense. Combat air patrols were layered. Radar plots informed interception before visual contact. Flexibility replaced rigidity. Where Japanese doctrine saw perfection in a single battle, American commanders embraced iteration, accepting limited losses in exchange for information. Each engagement became a lesson rather than an end. This divergence in thinking shaped how each side read the same encounters very differently. Steel was not just armor. It was time. American ships were built with repair in mind. Compartments were designed to be isolated. Fire suppression systems were redundant. Damage control teams trained to assume the ship would survive and act accordingly. Japanese ships prioritized offensive power and speed. Armor protection and internal subdivision were often sacrificed for range and striking force. In early battles, this advantage was devastating. In prolonged engagements, it became dangerous. The Pacific rewarded resilience more than elegance. And as steel hulls crossed the salt water again and again, those differences began to matter. Angle 4. Leadership under uncertainty. Leadership in the Pacific was shaped less by speeches and more by decisions made with incomplete information. Japanese naval leadership was technically brilliant and deeply experienced. Many senior officers had spent decades preparing for the war they believed was coming. Admirals like Isoroku Yamamoto understood America's industrial strength and warned that Japan could dominate for only a limited time. Yet, even Yamamoto operated within a system bound by doctrine. Plans, once approved, were difficult to alter. Deviating from expectations carried institutional risk. American leadership, by contrast, was uneven but flexible. Some commanders entered the war cautious, others aggressive. What unified them was authority to adapt. Mistakes were investigated, not hidden. Survivors reported openly. Lessons were distributed rapidly through the fleet. This difference did not guarantee success, but it allowed correction. From Tokyo, American actions often looked inefficient, even wasteful. Small raids expended resources for limited immediate gain. Early carrier strikes failed to deliver decisive blows. Japanese observers interpreted these as signs of impatience or inexperience. What they missed was accumulation. Each American operation refined coordination between air, sea, and logistics. Each damaged ship that returned to service contradicted Japanese assumptions about attrition. Each replaced pilot suggested that losses could be absorbed. Japan was winning battles, but losing its margin for error. The Pacific War was not just a contest of fleets. It was a contest of endurance. Japanese strategy depended on a quick collapse of enemy will. American strategy, once engaged, depended on persistence. These philosophies collided in the open ocean, where victories could be temporary and losses permanent. As engagements multiplied, the question was no longer who struck first, but who could continue striking after being hit. The answer would emerge not in theory, but in combat. Steel would meet steel. Salt would carry the wreckage, and the moment of reckoning was approaching. June 4th, 1942. Dawn in the Central Pacific arrives quietly. The sea is calm, almost indifferent. Low clouds drift above a steel-gray horizon. Beneath them, two fleets move without sight of one another, separated by miles of open water and layers of assumption. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this day is meant to confirm a theory refined over decades. Operation MI is designed to be precise. Midway Atoll will be struck at first light. Its airfield will be neutralized. American carriers, if they appear at all, will rush westward in response. Submarines and patrol aircraft will report their movements. Then, at the moment of Japan's choosing, the First Air Fleet will destroy them in a decisive blow. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo commands 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Together, they represent the core of Japan's naval air power. Their flight decks are crowded with aircraft that have trained together for years. Pilots are confident. Crews are experienced. The plan has been rehearsed repeatedly. At 0430 hours, Japanese aircraft begin launching toward Midway. The strike is well executed. Bombs fall on hangars, fuel tanks, and installations. But Midway does not go silent. Anti-aircraft fire continues. Aircraft remain operational. Reports from the strike leaders indicate that a second attack may be necessary. Nagumo now faces a choice, one that doctrine had not prepared him to make under pressure. His reserve aircraft are armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, intended for enemy ships. Switching them to land attack ordnance requires time. Deck crews begin a process. Bombs are rolled from magazines. Torpedoes are moved aside. Fuel hoses are dragged across hangar decks. Aircraft are crowded wingtip to wingtip in enclosed steel spaces. The carriers are momentarily at their most vulnerable. At the same time, American forces are already in motion. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz has concentrated 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway. Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea weeks earlier, was repaired in just 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, a feat that Japanese planners believed impossible. She sails with fresh paint hiding structural scars. American reconnaissance flights begin before dawn. Many search in the wrong direction. Others fail to make contact. Communication is uneven. Reports arrive late or incomplete. There is no single clear picture, only fragments. Despite this, American commanders decide to strike. At approximately 0700 hours, aircraft begin launching from U.S. carriers. Coordination is imperfect. Squadrons become separated. Some pilots never find the enemy. Others fly on fuel margins so thin that return is uncertain. Torpedo squadrons arrive first. Flying low and slow, they are exposed against the sky now crowded with Japanese fighters. The Type 0 descends with speed and precision. Anti-aircraft fire fills the air. One squadron after another is devastated. From Torpedo Squadron 8, launched from Hornet, only one pilot survives. Their attacks score no hits. From the Japanese perspective, the defense appears successful. The American threat seems disorganized, wasteful. Fighters are victorious. Ships remain intact. But success carries a hidden cost. Japanese combat air patrols are pulled downward, chasing torpedo planes at sea level. Fuel is burned. Ammunition is expended. Above, the sky empties. At 1,020 hours, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrive almost simultaneously from different directions. They break through cloud cover at altitude, unnoticed until the last moments. What they see below is a fleet caught mid-transition. Japanese carriers are turning into the wind to recover aircraft. Flight decks are crowded. Armed planes sit exposed. Fuel vapors hang in the air. Steel, meant to protect, now traps explosive force within. Dive bombers tip over into near-vertical descents. Sirens scream. Bombs fall. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are hit repeatedly. Explosions rip through hangar decks. Fires spread uncontrollably. Aircraft detonate where they sit. Damage control teams fight, but are overwhelmed. The design choices that once maximized offensive power now limit survivability. By 10:30 hours, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers are burning wrecks. Only Hiryu remains operational. From her deck, counterstrikes are launched with precision and urgency. Japanese aircraft find Yorktown and strike her twice, first with bombs, then with torpedoes. She lists, then stabilizes. Crews fight fires and flooding with disciplined speed. For a moment, she appears lost. Then she recovers enough to resume flight operations. The day is not yet decided, but the strategic balance has shifted irreversibly. In the space of less than 15 minutes, Japan has lost the core of its naval air strength, not through gradual attrition, but through a sudden collision between assumption and adaptation. Steel is burned. Salt has carried the smoke outward across the Pacific. And as the fires continue to spread, both sides begin to understand that the war they expected is already over. By midday on June 4th, 1942, the sea around Midway no longer looks empty. Smoke columns rise vertically from the water, dark against the pale sky. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burn uncontrollably, their once-ordered decks twisted by heat and internal explosions. Efforts to save them continue for hours, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. The First Air Fleet, long considered the sharpest instrument of Japanese naval power, has been shattered in a single morning. Only Hiryu remains operational, and her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, understands what is at stake. Withdrawal would preserve what remains of his force. Attack might yet change the outcome. Yamaguchi chooses to strike. Throughout the afternoon, Hiryu's aircraft locate and attack Yorktown. The first wave scores direct hits, damaging flight operations and killing crewmen. Damage control teams respond immediately. Fires are contained. Flooding is countered. In a demonstration of American repair doctrine, Yorktown appears crippled, then unexpectedly alive again. Japanese pilots, returning from the first strike, report her destroyed. They are wrong. A second strike is launched. Torpedoes hit Yorktown amidships. This time, the damage is decisive. Power fails. The ship lists heavily. Orders are given to abandon ship. She drifts, wounded but afloat, a symbol of both resilience and vulnerability. As evening approaches, American aircraft find Hiryu. Dive bombers descend through scattered cloud cover, repeating the pattern of the morning. Bombs strike the flight deck. Fires erupt. Aircraft detonate. Within hours, Hiryu 2 is burning beyond control. Admiral Yamaguchi chooses to go down with his ship. By nightfall, the battle's outcome is clear. Japan has lost 4 fleet carriers and more than 300 aircraft, along with many of its most experienced naval aviators. The United States has lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and dozens of aircraft and aircrew. The numerical comparison does not capture the true weight of the moment. For Japan, these losses cannot be replaced quickly, if at all. For the United States, replacement is already underway. On June 5th and 6th, the aftermath unfolds across the water. Japanese surface forces withdraw. American aircraft search for fleeing ships. Submarines close in. The damaged cruiser Mikoma is sunk. Mogami escapes, scarred. The ocean absorbs the wreckage silently. What Midway represents becomes clearer with each passing hour. This was not merely a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of a strategic assumption. The belief that American naval power could be neutralized long enough to force negotiation has been disproven. The decisive battle has occurred, but not on Japanese terms. The Japanese Navy had expected to control the timing, the location, and the conditions of confrontation. Instead, intelligence failure, rigid planning, and momentary vulnerability combined against them. The Pacific, once viewed as a defensive mode, has become a corridor for American counteroffensive power. For American commanders, the victory is sobering rather than triumphant. Losses are counted carefully. Reports are analyzed line by line. Survivors are questioned. There is no sense that the war is close to ending, only that its direction has changed. The steel imbalance is now undeniable. American shipyards continue to launch new carriers. Pilot training programs expand. Repair facilities operate without pause. The machinery of war, once mobilized, shows no sign of slowing. Japan, by contrast, must fight the rest of the war without the experienced carrier force that carried it to early victory. New ships will come. New pilots will be trained. But time, once believed to be Japan's ally, has turned against it. Midway does not end the Pacific War, but ends an idea. From this point forward, the conflict will no longer be shaped by surprise and assumption. It will be shaped by endurance, production, and the ability to absorb loss without collapse. Steel will continue to cross salt water, now with a different balance of power behind it. And in the wake of Midway, both sides prepare for a longer, harsher war than either had fully imagined. The ocean remains vast. The fighting is far from over. In the days following the Battle of Midway, the Pacific returns to an uneasy quiet. The smoke disperses. Debris drifts. Oil slicks spread thinly across the water before dissolving into the sea. Beneath the surface, wreckage settles slowly into darkness, joining the silent geography of the ocean floor. For the men who survived, there is little time to reflect. Ships turn back toward Pearl Harbor. Aircraft are counted. Names are read aloud. The scale of the loss becomes clear with each report. Japan has lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Over 3,000 sailors and airmen are dead. More than 300 aircraft are destroyed. Even more devastating than the numbers is the character of the losses. Many of Japan's most experienced pilots and deck crews, men trained over years of meticulous preparation, are gone. Their absence cannot be filled quickly or quietly. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Midway creates an operational vacuum. Carrier divisions that once formed the spearhead of naval strategy no longer exist. Remaining carriers must be reorganized. Surface forces, once intended to play a supporting role, are now forced to operate without the protective umbrella of overwhelming air power. The psychological impact is immediate. Japanese command communications grow cautious. Operational plans are rewritten. The assumption of American inferiority, so central to pre-war thinking, can no longer be maintained. Reports from surviving officers describe surprise, confusion, and disbelief at the speed and coordination of the American attack. Yet the defeat is not publicly acknowledged. In Japan, the loss is concealed from the population. Official announcements speak vaguely of heavy fighting. The truth is known only to senior leadership. This silence creates its own strain. Without public reckoning, lessons are absorbed slowly, filtered through hierarchy and doctrine. Across the Pacific, The American response is restrained. There are no victory parades, no grand declarations. Admiral Nimitz issues sober assessments. The Navy understands how close the outcome came to being very different. If American dive bombers had arrived minutes later, if Yorktown had not returned to the fight, if intelligence had failed, Midway could have ended in disaster. Instead, it becomes a foundation. American commanders study the battle with intensity. Every phase is dissected. Communication failures are noted. Coordination problems are acknowledged. Tactical successes are codified. Damage control performance is praised and standardized further across the fleet. Midway does not create American confidence. It channels it. In practical terms, the battle shifts the initiative. Japanese plans for further eastward expansion are canceled. The threat to Hawaii recedes. Defensive lines are pulled back. Resources are redirected toward holding what has already been taken. For the United States, this shift opens possibilities. The Pacific War is no longer purely reactive. Planning begins for limited offensives. Attention turns south toward the Solomon Islands. The idea of pushing west, once unthinkable so early, enters operational discussion. Steel, now, is moving in greater volume. In American shipyards, production schedules accelerate. New Essex-class carriers are already under construction. Escort carriers, destroyers, and submarines multiply. Fuel storage expands. Airfields are surveyed and carved from coral and jungle alike. The sea becomes crowded with movement. At the individual level, the aftermath is quieter, heavier. Survivors write letters. Some describe the battle in fragments. Others avoid details entirely. Pilots who returned without their squadron mate struggle to explain why they lived when others did not. Damage control, crews remember heat, smoke, and darkness more vividly than explosions. For Japanese survivors, the experience is isolating. Many return to bases without their ships, reassigned or sidelined. The loss of comrades is compounded by the knowledge that their defeat cannot be spoken of openly. Midway has altered the internal rhythm of the war. What was once a series of rapid advances becomes a slower, more deliberate struggle. Each side reassesses risk. Each side recalculates time. The Pacific, unchanged in its vastness, now feels smaller, less a barrier, more a corridor where pressure can be applied. Yet the war remains undecided. Japan still holds vast territories. Its fleet, though wounded, is not destroyed. Its army continues to fight across Asia and the Pacific. For the United States, Midway is a turning point, but not an ending. The next phase will demand sustained effort. And as plans begin to take shape, the consequences of Midway ripple outward toward future battles where steel and salt will again decide what endures. The days and weeks after Midway are defined as much by calculation as by reflection. On both sides, the battle has created a new reality, one that will shape every decision in the Pacific for months, even years to come. For Japan, the losses are immediate, tangible, and irreplaceable. For fleet carriers are gone, along with their air wings. Veteran pilots and skilled deck crews, men who trained together for years, whose coordination had been refined to near perfection, are dead. Japan's industrial base cannot replace them quickly. Unlike steel, skill and experience cannot be fabricated in a factory. This creates a tactical gap that cannot be bridged in the short term. The Imperial Navy is forced to reorganize. Remaining carriers are reassigned, but every deployment is now tempered by caution. Commanders know that every encounter carries risk that cannot be absorbed indefinitely. Strategically, the Japanese Navy begins a subtle recalibration. Ambitious plans to seize more Pacific islands are slowed. Expansion toward Fiji and Samoa is postponed. The notion of luring the United States into a decisive battle, the core assumption of Kantai-Kessen, is no longer plausible. Japan still holds the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, and its troops are well entrenched, but the illusion of uncontested supremacy evaporates. Japanese commanders confront a new, harsh reality. American resolve is not fragile. The Pacific is not an insurmountable moat. Time, once considered an ally, is now a neutral force that favors the side capable of endurance. Meanwhile, the United States interprets the battle differently. Midway confirms what intelligence had predicted. Japan is vulnerable when operational assumptions collide with reality. American planners recognize that decisive engagement does not always require superior numbers, but rather timing, coordination, and resilience. Yorktown's survival, even temporarily, and the disciplined execution of dive bomber strikes illustrate the importance of training, improvisation, and industrial support. Lessons are quickly codified. Standard operating procedures are revised to reflect the value of reconnaissance, surprise, and layered attack. American leadership begins to treat experience as a resource to be cultivated rather than exhausted. The human consequences of Midway are profound. Survivors from both sides carry memories that will not fade. Japanese sailors returning to Yokosuka or Kure face the impossible task of resuming duties while knowing that comrades, often the most skilled among them, will never return. There is an unspoken understanding that the war has changed irreversibly. For American sailors and pilots, survival is coupled with the weight of witnessing friends fall. Every flight, every deck operation, every watch at sea carries a reminder that victory is hard-won and fragile. Fatigue, fear, and focus become inseparable. Yet with each mission, experience accumulates and capability grows. In broader terms, Midway reshapes the operational map. Japanese forces pull back to consolidate positions across the Western Pacific. Airfields are reinforced on strategic islands, supply lines adjusted. Submarine patrols intensify along approaches to Hawaii. The loss of carriers forces the Japanese to rely on land-based aircraft to project power over greater distances, stretching logistics and reducing flexibility. At the same time, American planners begin preparing limited offensive actions, seeking to capitalize on momentum. Attention turns toward the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the next points of engagement in a slowly tightening Pacific net. Industrial consequences become clearer over the following months. In American shipyards, lessons from Midway inform both construction and repair. Essex-class carriers are launched in record numbers. Shipbuilding techniques are standardized for efficiency. Aircraft production is expanded, with new models reflecting operational experience. Radar and communications technology are integrated more effectively across the fleet. Fuel stockpiles grow, aircrew training accelerates, and repair yards operate around the clock. Every sunk Japanese ship represents not just a victory, but a justification for increased industrial output, a demonstration that replacement and persistence can overwhelm early advantage. The psychological dimension is equally critical. Midway marks the first time the Japanese command sees, unequivocally, that American industrial and human capacity can withstand early losses and respond decisively. It introduces doubt into a system built on absolute confidence. Japanese commanders must now plan under the knowledge that the United States will not simply fold. Conversely, American confidence grows, but it is tempered by the realization that victory requires sustained effort, discipline, and a willingness to pay heavy costs. Each side internalizes lessons that will shape the battles to come, from the Solomons to the Marianas, and ultimately toward the Philippines. Losses also illuminate limitations in doctrine. Japanese planning had assumed surprise, controlled timing, and minimal counterstrike risk. Midway demonstrates that intelligence, adaptability, and rapid response can overturn those assumptions. American dive bombers, arriving almost simultaneously from multiple directions, exploit momentary vulnerabilities on Japanese flight decks. Coordination, timing, and the capacity to absorb attrition become decisive. Conversely, Japan's reliance on perfect execution and untested assumptions proves catastrophic. The balance between doctrine and flexibility, once theoretical, is now evident in blood and fire. Reports and reflections in the months that follow highlight the importance of resilience and redundancy. Ships that could have been permanently lost are salvaged. Aircraft carriers repaired quickly return to service. Aircrew are retrained and redeployed. Intelligence networks are refined. The Battle of Midway leaves a quiet but unmistakable imprint on history. It is a moment when assumption clashes with reality, when doctrine meets endurance, and when the vast Pacific, once thought a shield, becomes a stage for resilience and adaptation. For Japan, Midway is a turning point. The carriers lost, the pilots gone, and the strategic assumptions shattered signal that the war will no longer unfold according to plan. The illusion of unassailable superiority fades. Japanese leadership must confront the limits of preparation when faced with an enemy capable of rapid adaptation and industrial persistence. Doctrine alone cannot protect a nation from the consequences of underestimating an opponent. For the United States, the victory confirms a deeper truth. Power is measured not only by what exists on paper or in the hangar, but by the ability to replace, repair, and learn. The survival of Yorktown, the decisive strikes against Japanese carriers, and the operational coordination achieved under extreme pressure illustrate the value of flexibility, training, and planning. Industrial might, the invisible fleet, proves as decisive as any vessel of steel. Midway is also a human story. Sailors, pilots, and commanders on both sides confront mortality and responsibility. Fear, fatigue, courage, and decision-making under fire shape the outcome as much as tonnage and ordnance. The sea absorbs lives and machines alike, yet also carries lessons forward. Every action at Midway ripples outward into subsequent battles, shaping tactics, strategy, and expectations. Ultimately, the battle demonstrates a timeless truth about warfare. Assumptions, however meticulously calculated, are fragile. Steel can burn. Salt can corrode. Only persistence, adaptation, and the relentless application of human and industrial capacity determine who endures. In the vastness of the Pacific, Midway is not simply a battle of ships and planes. It is a confrontation of foresight, preparation, and resilience. As the smoke lifts and the ocean calms, the war continues. But the currents have shifted. Midway proves that even the most confident adversary can be tested, and that, in the collision of steel and salt, the measure of a nation's strength is revealed, not in a single moment, but in its capacity to endure and respond. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, becomes the proving ground where assumptions are tested, and history is written in fire, smoke, and salt water.